everybody. This is Hamlet Yousef. Thank you for everyone who's made the time to join into our podcast here today. I'm delighted to be here with three guests, Sebastian and Leland. The Irregular Warfare Initiative, I think, seeks to raise awareness around the complexities of conflict that span just kinetic conflict with militaries. I think in the world we're in today, economic warfare, legal warfare, and irregular warfare as kind of the overwrapper or more present and prevalent. So want to do a quick round of introductions, and then I want to try to play the good role is get out of the way and let our experts unpack some insightful information on how Chinese complex activities work throughout the Americas in support of driving the CCP initiatives here. So by way of background, my name is Hamlet Yousef. I run a venture fund that's involved in investing at the intersection of national security, defense, and disruptive technologies. Have prior government service. And then before that, spent quite a bit of time in the private sector as well. Also, I have had the good fortune of joining the Irregular Warfare Initiative recently to particularly get involved in their economic and legal warfare project. So rather than getting into introductions myself on Sebastian and Leland, I'll let both of you guys introduce yourselves. And then from there, we'll jump into the meat of the matter. Sebastian, you want to kick us off?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much, Hamlet. I'm a senior reporter with ProPublica, which does investigative reporting in the public interest. I cover international security issues, organized crime, terrorism, intelligence, justice around the world. And I've been at ProPublica 15 years. Before that, I was at the Los Angeles Times as a foreign correspondent at the Mexican border in South America and Europe, the Middle East. And my coverage is very much focused on those same kinds of issues. And it's great to be here.
Great. Thanks, Sebastian. Leland?
Yeah, my name is Leland Lazarus. I'm the founder and CEO of Lazarus Consulting. It's a geopolitical firm that focuses on China's engagement in the Western Hemisphere. Before that, my background has been focused on China-Latin America relations through government. So State Department, I was a foreign service officer in China and in the Caribbean. And then the Department of Defense at U.S. Southern Command focused very much on China's growing engagement in the Western Hemisphere.
Excellent. Good. Well, let's jump right into this. I think everyone's been really focused on two great conflicts that shaped the beginning of the 21st century, and these are the kind of the war on terror and the conflicts that we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq. But since the water seeded there over the last 10 years, what began as a great power competition is starting to morph into a bit more of a hybrid complex conflict. And I think at the heart of that has been the battle between potentially two opposing worldviews. One that is we're very familiar with, which is independent democracies, individual self-liberties versus what is the China model coming out of Beijing. So to jump right into it, given both your experiences in Latin America, let's start there. Let's talk about how Chinese organized crime networks have evolved and played a role not only in America but in the Western Hemisphere and throughout Latin America. I know this is an area you guys are both very versed on, but let's begin with your perspectives there. Then I think we can probably jump into some more details as we get going.
Sebastian?
Sure. I mean, I've been, I started covering Latin America in the 1990s, and there was already a presence of Chinese organized crime, and I encountered it very dramatically in human smuggling, waves of smuggling boats coming into Mexico of Chinese bound for the United States, very specifically New York, very specifically Flushing, New York, and then in traveling, which remains an epicenter of all this activity decades later. And then in South America, in places like the tri-border area where Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil come together, having seen Chinese organized crime there involved in contraband, in extortion, in smuggling of people always. But what is striking, I think, and what I've tried to cover in the past 10 years is the real rise to dominance and centrality of Chinese organized crime among the many formidable criminal organizations that there are in Latin America, but the way Chinese organized crime has quietly but inexorably taken over key areas, specifically money laundering, right? It's become the indispensable dominant money launderer and underground banker, right? Which are two slightly different things for the cartels, particularly the Mexican cartels throughout the Americas. So I'm including Canada, the United States, Mexico, and further south. And and it has really revolutionized and strengthened itself, revolutionized that market in the ease which is given the Mexican cartels to operate with its money laundering services, and empowered the cartels as well. And that is really at the center of a series of other activities that the Chinese organized crime is still very involved in, including smuggling of people, the takeover of the marijuana industry, the multi-billion-dollar marijuana industry in the United States, and in other parts of the world as well, like in Europe and in Chile, places like that. So it has really become very central to a lot of activities. And the other obvious area in which it is central is the fentanyl crisis in the United States, because of the role of Chinese companies and Chinese organized crime in both the smuggling of fentanyl itself, and as that market has evolved in the smuggling of precursors to the cartels in Mexico. So you really see this happening in this hemisphere and echoes elsewhere. So when I talk about underground banking and talking to, say, police in Italy who are investigating the Calabrian mafia, the 'Ndrangheta, and they talk about the 'Ndrangheta getting cocaine in Colombia, they use Chinese intermediaries in both places to make the deal, so no money actually has to physically move. So what we're seeing in the Americas, I think, is a global phenomenon that is very dramatic and very worrisome.
Great. I think there's a 6-hour podcast based just on that right there. So
that's right. No, absolutely.
Great start.
Absolutely. I would describe this as it's two sides of the same coin of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So over the past decade, obviously, we've seen Chinese state-owned enterprises, private companies, other entities really going out around the world to expand influence, investment. And I call this really the Silk Road of crime, because along with the very legitimate investments and economic activity that Chinese companies are engaging in around the world, there's also been these free riders as well, these individuals who on one hand may be business people, but on the other hand may also be engaging in various illicit activities from Southeast Asia to Africa to increasingly Latin America and the Caribbean. And I remember distinctly when I was serving at U.S. Southern Command as a special assistant to the commander at U.S. Southern Command at the time. And the biggest question that we would always have is, the two priorities for Southcom was counter PRC and counter transnational criminal organizations. But I think over the years, we've seen a combination of those two threats in the expansion of these Chinese criminal networks that in many ways are providing the financial foundations on which the Sinaloa cartel, Jalisco cartel, and other criminal networks in Latin America and the Caribbean are essentially using in order to launder money. And so, I think in the conversation in the United States, it focuses a lot on the fentanyl precursors, as it should, right? Because, of course, at the height of the epidemic of fentanyl precursors, which is still going on, still ravaging so many different communities throughout the United States. But, of course, a lot of the vast majority of the precursors are coming from China, Chinese chemical manufacturers, India and elsewhere. But it's much more than just the fentanyl precursors, right? It's the money laundering and the flying money mirror transactions that they're engaging in. It's also the wildlife trafficking. It's the human smuggling. It's the illegal gambling in casinos. And so it's really a whole host of these activities that constitute the Silk Road of crime.
Mm. So I guess let's start here. There's a ton of questions that are already running through my head, but one, it sounds like the spreading of Chinese criminal activity, organized crime activity in the Americas is not an isolated event. You guys are saying this is in coordination, not just tacit approval, but part of a broader strategy coming out of directly from Beijing and the CCP, or is this more of a, hey, we're just going to turn the other way and let you go operate where we go and just not get involved? If you're looking at a sliding scale, which one do you think this falls into?
Yeah, I had not seen any direct evidence to suggest that Xi Jinping is calling, a local gangster in order to further foreign policy, right? But there's growing evidence and growing examples of a symbiotic relationship that is being developed between certain Chinese criminal actors and CCP entities, whether it be the United Front, whether it be the Ministry of State Security, and other entities. And I'll give you some specific examples. A famous case is Wan Kukoi, whose alias is Broken Tooth. And he is both the head of what's called the World Hongmen Brotherhood Association, which is a United Front affiliated group all throughout Southeast Asia. But he also has another hat, which is the head of the 14K Triads, right? Which is a large Chinese criminal network. And this is all open source reporting from Washington Post, Reuters, and elsewhere, that he has basically led a region-wide criminal network all throughout Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. But not only that, he's also used his illicit ties and business ties in order to further Belt and Road projects in the countries where he operates. And even so much so that he works in Palau, for example, to try to pressure local politicians to switch diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China. So I use Wan Kukoi as an example because he's kind of a microcosm of this trend that we're seeing really all over the world. There is somebody like a Wan Kukoi in Chile, in Jamaica, in Trinidad and Tobago, in Paraguay. There was another example in a recent Al Jazeera documentary that profiled a guy by the name of Shi Dizi, who's, again, been a businessman in Paraguay for over a decade. He's allegedly engaged in a whole host of different criminal activities, but he also travels to Brazil quite frequently in order to meet with the Chinese embassy there, in order to report on ways in which he's been trying to bribe local politicians there to switch diplomatic recognition for Paraguay from Taiwan to China. So it's basically just to say, again, there's no direct sort of evidence of this being directed at the highest levels.
Yeah.
But I think there's this symbiotic relationship in which they're both benefiting.
I think that's right. I think, Leland, you could say that there are many broken teeth, Koi, many versions of Koi around the world. Yeah. And what is striking is the way these patterns repeat themselves. And where I've looked at it and where I think it is dramatic and does suggest it gets close to being evidence of intentional policy is on the transnational repression and political influence front, right? So I looked at, and I think I was among the first to report this, in Italy, in Spain, in the United States, and connections to Latin America, you have the phenomenon of people who are simultaneously heads, important leaders of the diaspora, of diaspora associations, who are also convicted or accused criminals. And in Italy, in the city of Prato, in Barcelona, in Oklahoma City, involved in marijuana, are also people who are involved in running for example, the secret police stations that the Chinese Ministry of Public Security was operating out of diaspora associations to spy on and repress the diaspora, right, to go after dissidents and fugitives, right? That is striking, and it repeats itself. And you have again, there was a quadruple murder among marijuana gangsters, Chinese marijuana gangsters in Oklahoma, and the Chinese Consul General, Washington, D.C., rushed to the Fujianese Association of Oklahoma City to meet with people in the community to talk about these murders. And we went through the photos and identified, more than half a dozen of people who were convicted or accused criminals who he was meeting with as leaders of the community, several of whom had connections to the secret police station in Manhattan, where the Justice Department had prosecuted people for transnational repression. So, and these are people who you see mixing both with Chinese diplomats, people in the United Front, people in the Ministry of Public Security, convicted criminals in the U.S., Chinese Americans visiting members of the Ministry of Public Security, and acting as interlocutors, representatives of the diaspora with U.S. politicians, contributing to campaigns, engaging in what can only be described as political influence activities. So I think that is striking and suggests, a willingness of the Chinese security forces to use diaspora leaders, no matter what their background, to further and increase their power, and really to treat diaspora communities as if they were colonies, overseas colonies of the Chinese police state.
Wow, that's frightening, because now, so to both your points, there's no smoking gun, so to speak, tying Chinese illicit activity to the state and to Beijing, but it sounds like a growing body of circumstantial evidence that's showing that by use of cultural centers, by use of what you talked about, which was actually grossly underreported, was these police stations, the secret police stations throughout the U.S. and other countries as a proxy, as a means to tap into the diaspora, and then use the diaspora as kind of their, lack of a better word, their irregular warfare army within a host country. And I just want to be very clear here. This is not meant to be a bash China conversation. I think if we talk to anybody, the average rank and file Chinese businessman that's operating across the world is not meant to look nefarious. But what I think we're seeing is the Chinese using that ecosystem. They're using those profiles as a means to have their agents operating, in some cases, not only in our backyard, but on the home front. Is that kind of what we're seeing here?
I think that's right. And I think your point is a very good one. You always have to be careful on the bash China front. And remember that the greatest victims of this are Chinese people in the Chinese diaspora themselves, right?
100% agree.
Repression and all that. But for example, in talking to law enforcement in the UK or in Canada, the police in the UK are starting to talk about Chinese organized crime as state-sponsored crime, using that term because they keep seeing their suspects bumping up against working with people in the Chinese state and in the United Front. The same in Canada. You hear the same, and again, anecdotally and many reports, including ones that Leland has done, you see the same thing all through the Americas, and particularly in Latin America, which is fertile turf.
Excellent. Yeah, I bring a personal perspective to this. I'm not Chinese, but I was born in Iran, raised here in the U.S., and very fond of the accomplishments of the Iranian community. But there's no doubt the IRGC Quds Force and the Iranian regime uses the diaspora to hide their operatives. And those bad apples represent a very, very small portion of the Iranian diaspora community. But those guys are out doing some serious harm. And it sounds like that's the same playbook the Chinese are following. Average Chinese diaspora, average Chinese person, even average Chinese citizen in China is not necessarily nefarious, but there's those small bad elements that are out there doing basically the deeds of the parties. What it sounds like here.
Absolutely. If I might add that, I'm glad that you mentioned the Iranian community, Hamlet, because there's some great research being done by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime to really look at this from a conceptual standpoint, right? And the concept that they've come up with is this term geocriminality. And I love it.
I love that term. Yeah.
I love it because it really sort of personifies what we may be seeing here. And, not just amongst the Chinese, right? The Iranian government does it. The Russian government certainly does it, right? Leveraging criminal networks in order to further their foreign policy aims, right?
Yep.
And so we already see the Chinese government doing that for cyber crimes, right? Hiring China-based cyber hackers in order to give some sort of fig leaf of plausible deniability, right? But we all know where the money goes and who's supporting it. It's the next plausible, leap to say that these groups can be leveraged in order to pay off local officials to support the expansion of BRI projects.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to mention is, again, the victims being, members of the Chinese community. And one group that we haven't mentioned yet is Chinese students, right? Now, again, vast majority of the Chinese students who are operating or studying here in the U.S., upstanding, really smart people who want to, better their lives, right? 300,000 of them. But there is growing evidence from DEA, FBI, and others that some of these Chinese criminal networks are leveraging Chinese students in order to help open up bank accounts so that they can launder money through it.
Yep.
Or help to become basically money mules, and then they get a little bit of money for it. And sometimes the Chinese students don't even know that what they may be doing is really illegal. Maybe they might think that they're helping their tongbao, their countrymen, right?
Yep.
Or that they're serving another Chinese term, daigou, which is to be like a purchasing agent on the part of a Chinese family member or a Chinese friend, right? But we've got to put into perspective the fact that, again, in many ways, the Chinese community are victims of that, and we need to work on an outreach and sort of education campaign on the ways in which CCP elements may be leveraging them for nefarious purposes.
And that's a very good
fantastic.
point. That's a very good point on the students, because you think of the overlay there. I did a story about the incredible networks that the CCP uses to control Chinese students around the world at universities, at US campuses and European campuses in Australia, where if a student says something he shouldn't have said about Tibet in a classroom on Wednesday, his family gets a visit back in his home province in China from MSS on the weekend saying, I understand your son back at that fancy university in the West is saying things he shouldn't be saying. So there's real-time monitoring, especially by the Chinese student associations of any kind of dissidents, and because there's concern about these students. So you think of organized crime preying on the students and the control of the CCP, and those two things converging. The same thing in the UK as well, where you have the money laundering, the money mules, the use of banks, and even British police say Chinese students being contacted by organized crime and saying, okay, we're going to need your apartment between 2 and 4 p.m. Somebody's going to drop a suitcase and then someone's going to pick them up. So you see, and there was a poll done of these students, and most of them said, if someone comes and asks me to do that, I'm going to say yes, right? The same way if the consulate calls and says, you need to go out to this demonstration against this student who was talking about Tibet, they go, right? So those forces are converging and powerful.
Mm-hmm. So this is local either state affiliated entities or soft affiliated entities using agents to assert leverage over, lack of a better word, civilians to advance a CCP objective or initiative is what this sounds like. That's right.
There's a great anecdote. Leland, you'll remember the date better than I will. I want to say it's 2008, with the running of the Olympic torch, where Chinese students are bused. I believe it's to San Francisco, and they're being run by Chinese intelligence officers with walkie-talkies to interfere with pro-Tibet demonstrators, I think it was. I mean, it's striking, right? The brazenness and the dimensions of it.
Absolutely.
That's frightening. Let's make a small pivot here. I think both of you guys have touched on this in the past. No covert operation or black or gray operation can exist without funds. So let's talk about how flow of funds works in some of the innovative ways where the CCP through their indirect collaboration with organized crime. What are some of the more legitimate ways where funds are being funneled to support CCP initiatives, and what are some of the, I guess, more innovative money laundering or black ways where this is happening, both throughout the Americas, but also here at home?
Sebastian?
Well, certainly on the money laundering front, I mean, what you had, if you look at the evolution of money laundering in the Americas, and basically the Mexican cartels being the prime player, since the early 1990s, which is when I was covering them at the Mexican border. Money laundering then, all this money was being made, these mountains of cash were being made in drug trafficking in the United States. And the goal of the Mexican cartels was to get those dollars back to Mexico and turn them into pesos.
Right.
And in the beginning, there was actually physical movement with trucks and cars, right? Bulk cash smuggling. Then there was the use of banks and money exchange houses to move the money. Many of the banks got in trouble because they were doing, things that were quite brazen. Then there were specialists who rose in the past 20 years, like the Colombians, who kind of did in the black market exchange in Colombia, laundered for the Mexicans. Hezbollah connected Lebanese throughout the hemisphere were very involved in that with elaborate trade-based money laundering schemes. But all of that was expensive. They were charging as much as 18% on the dollar. It took time. It could take weeks and even months. And it exposed the money to being busted or to damage or to ripoffs. And so what the Chinese organized crime does really in the past 10 to 15 years, interestingly, really during the starting of the regime of Xi Jinping is when this really rises. And when there's the selective crackdown on corruption in China and further impediments on the movement of the fortunes of people in China out of China, what Chinese organized crime does is go to the Mexican cartels, with this unbeatable deal, which is we will launder your money, say $1 million on the streets of Chicago in a day. We'll do it for a very low percentage, and we even guarantee that if it gets lost or somehow we'll reimburse you. And they're able to do that because they are making all this money on the other end, which is from the Chinese elite. So the way it works is Chinese criminal brokers in the United States working with Confederates in Mexico collect money from the Mexican cartels. The same amount is given to the cartels that same day in Mexico. And then what they're doing is selling that cash to people in the Chinese elite so they can get in the United States, or their relatives or their representatives, so they can get their fortunes out of China, right? Yeah. So these are mirror transactions, right? And that really became the money laundering scheme that is really, there are many others, and there's still use of shell companies and Bitcoin increasingly and trade-based money laundering, but the Chinese have really taken over laundering, but with their incredible stockpile of cash, which is at the center of all these other criminal activities they're involved in. But that has really generated all kinds of money that then gets put back into, for example, into the marijuana business, where which basically black market marijuana has been taken over by Chinese organized crime in the United States, and they are moving a lot of the proceeds that they make off the laundering into the money laundering, into the pig butchering, the movement of people, gambling. So it's what is interesting about the crime convergence with Chinese organized crime is that I think this money, this global underground banking system is at the heart of it, and wherever you look, in Europe and Africa and Australia, they're at the heart of the illegal banking industry.
Excellent points.
I mean, just to give you a scale of this, right? The U.S. Treasury Financial Crime Enforcement Network recently released a report saying that over the past 4 years, Chinese money launderers have laundered $312 billion to the U.S. financial system. Jesus. With a B, right? And they're using the exact mirror transactions that Sebastian had mentioned. And because of the $50,000 capital flight control that China has, a lot of wealthy Chinese individuals, they need U.S. dollars in order to buy real estate in the U.S. or to pay for their son or daughter's university tuition, right? And so they become willing customers of some of these Chinese money laundering networks. But I also want to stress that again, the money laundering and the fentanyl precursors, these are just some ways of many in which these Chinese criminal networks are making their money, right? Mm-hmm. Another key way is wildlife trafficking. Mm-hmm. So think shark fins and Totowaba fish bladders in Mexico, and jaguar skins in Peru and Bolivia and elsewhere. These Chinese criminal networks have become the key wildlife trafficking networks all throughout Latin America and the Caribbean as well. And there's great reporting, great research done by an NGO called Earth League International, led by a guy named Andrea Crosta. Really fantastic. They've identified various nodes, specific individuals and nodes from Mexico all the way down to Chile and Ecuador, really mapping out how these networks are operating. So and again, I want to mention this idea of crime convergence, right? That in many ways it is the same actors engaging in all these kinds of criminal activities. And so if we try to go after just the money laundering or just the wildlife trafficking or just the digital scam farms, we're actually missing the point that this is a real ecosystem that needs to get after. Yeah.
And I think the other thing about that is then we get again to the state involvement or the state awareness question, right? Yeah. So first of all, if you talk to the DEA agents who I've talked to who have done these in-depth investigations on money laundering, they see all this suspicious movement of money going back into China and through Chinese banks and businesses, and find it hard to believe that in the most fearsome police state in the world, that is going by without being noticed, right? Second of all, you have the high-level DEA people active and former have said to me, and I've quoted them in stories, that they see movement of drug money, of criminal money from the Chinese mafias going in to help finance Belt and Road projects in Latin America.
Yeah.
You also have dramatic examples, and one that always, I think, has not gotten the attention it should have was the Chinese bank in Madrid, the ICBC, whose top 4 executives were convicted by Spanish law enforcement for brazenly laundering organized crime money through the bank, through this bank branch for 5 years in Madrid, laundering money back to China. These are, not tellers, these are executives, right? So there is this sense of either by omission or commission or involvement that this is beneficial to the Chinese state, and whether because of corruption or some larger strategy or both, that it is, it is thriving.
Yeah, and I think this brings us to the crux of what we're talking about here. I mean, this is the Irregular Warfare Initiatives is a sponsor of this podcast, and for those of you guys who are not fully versed on what irregular warfare is, and without getting overly technical, it's it's basically anything short of conventional. So using the legal apparatus, using financial networks, using gray and criminal arms, using economic warfare. Those are all various different elements of irregular warfare. It sounds like in this case, the Chinese or the CCP is basically almost to a letter executing various facets of the unconventional warfare book doctrine that was written by a couple of PLA generals over 25 years ago. How do you fight an adversary without fighting? China doesn't want to get into a direct conflict with us, but it sounds like what they're doing is they're throwing almost like a whole of society effort against us through proxies, both witting, unwitting, and coerced, to find ways to damage the foundations of Western society. That's something I think has been playing out over the last 20 years. I think we're just starting to wake up to it. But let's focus, I guess, real granular. Why such a growing presence in the Americas? Why are the Americas so important to Xi and the CCP as part of this effort?
Well, I've done research on this recently, really tracking the development of China's strategic aims in Latin America and the Caribbean over the past 2 decades, right? From their first white paper on the region in 2008, all the way to just a couple of days ago, they released another white paper for Latin America and the Caribbean that will guide its engagement in the region over the next 3 years, right? And what you see is, when you think about 2008, the financial crisis was just in full swing, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Western countries were, of course, reeling from it. And China at the time found this as an opening to expand its own economic influence and engagement throughout the global South, right? And Latin America and the Caribbean in particular. So from the very beginning, you start to see mostly discussions about trade and investment, right? But what you also see over time is those strategic goals expanding into politics, expanding into security and law enforcement, expanding into space, right? And so now you see, whether it be the China and Community for Latin American and Caribbean States, or CELAC, their joint action plan from 2025, 2026, and 2027 is a really detailed laundry list of all the strategic aims that China has, which includes not just increasing trade beyond the $500 billion in bilateral trade, but also continuing to expand space engagement, right? So similar to the Neuquén Space Research Facility in Argentina,
Mm-hmm.
They want to continue to expand that into Chile, into Brazil, into other areas in Latin America and the Caribbean. Low Earth orbit satellites as well through EMOSAT. Yep. You see an increase in the Antarctic, right? An expansion there because of its geostrategic area. It talks about the need to increase friendly ports. That's what it says, right? But again, it's a response to, of course, the very real concern about Chinese engagement in various ports all around the Western Hemisphere that could be used for, of course, commercial purposes, but also for military and surveillance purposes as well. So you really see, again, a full court press and an expansion of strategic goals from the Chinese in this region, and that they'll use all opportunities available in order to reach those goals, including the potential leverage of Chinese criminal networks.
I think that's right. And you have in our, again, to use the cliche, our backyard, this multi-front advance. I mean, it's funny because you go back 20 years and the U.S., which was, supposedly the dominant diplomatic commercial player, was in many countries in Latin America, and sort of there was like, that was the area where, say, Spain, the Telefonica, the national telephone company, was doing a lot of big investments in Latin America. So, the Spanish are really flexing their muscles. That all seems minuscule now, when the way that this Chinese bulldozer has come in on multiple fronts, as Leland said, legal and illegal. And what's interesting about Latin America is you have a region that in many ways has countries that are very prosperous, right, and that are growing, like Chile, like Brazil, like Argentina, like Mexico, yet at the same time have all these, these problems with weak governance, with the rule of law, with, just areas where it's very easy to move in on many fronts. And you see, for example, some of the organized crime cases where money launderers are involved with Chinese state connections, not just involved in moving drugs and money, but also moving people and fraudulent documents, and a remarkable capacity. I'm thinking of one money launderer in particular, a Chinese Mexican-American named Zishi Li, who had a thriving fraudulent document racket where he had infiltrated the bureaucracies in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Suriname, and was getting, and there's at least one documented case to a senior Chinese military officer gets one of these Guatemalan, these are real documents provided fraudulently. So you see a remarkable capacity, and Earth League International has done very good work on this too, for the so quote unquote legitimate, say, Chinese state-owned companies to use the criminal infrastructure to do things like bribe an official to get a contract for a state company, right? Mm-hmm. Or help a state company move goods illicitly, right, to avoid customs or across a border, or things like that. So it's this multi-front approach in an area that we sort of thought we dominated, and I think it's, the U.S. is still coming to terms with how transformative this effort has been on the part of the Chinese. And let's not forget how powerful they are in Canada on the other side, right?
Oh, yeah.
How so it sounds like not only are they trying to assert influence and drive their objectives, but in some cases, definitely in the Americas and arguably in the U.S. as well, they're using these influence campaigns to financially potentially motivate policymakers and decision makers to pass pass legislation that is more, lack of a better word, more pro-Beijing. That seems to be a growing threat and a growing reality that we need to be more attuned to. So
100%.
Look, I think we were, as a venture fund, we were very early, 7-8 years ago, talking about this coming Cold War 2.0 between Russia, China, and the U.S. I've always said very, very, very vocally on LinkedIn that this was going to be a technology-driven arms race, and I think technology and disruptive technologies are going to play a critical part, because not only is that technology coming from the private sector, but it sounds like this conflict is likely going to be less and less kinetic, at least initially, and it's going to be much more asymmetric, much more irregular. So economic warfare seems to be a real thing, which leads me to discussions around kind of the cognitive aspects of cognitive warfare and this conflict we're in. Not to sound too flippant, but if the Belt and Road Initiative is a means to introduce criminality and control into a developing nation, it seems like the fine detail in the loan covenants should not only mention that if the country defaults, the CCP steals the assets, but you're going to get a bunch of bad actors in the diaspora, not the entire diaspora, but you're going to have some bad actors in your backyard that are going to be working directly against your homeland. As we tune into the economic impacts of what's happening in Latin America and what role private capital and private industry can play, to come in and push out Chinese capital. How important is messaging? So the average Chilean, average Peruvian, average Brazilian, Argentino doesn't view America as this evil imperialistic power, but starts viewing the CCP more of a parasitic power that's basically sucking their country dry. How widespread is that, and what's the opportunity set for that look like?
I'll start off here. I do think I'm going to dish out a little bit of criticism here. I think the U.S. government, we have consistently given ourselves our own goals, right? We have not prioritized the region in a way that we should have over the past several decades. I am encouraged by the new national security strategy that just came out that finally prioritizes the Western Hemisphere number one above Indo-Pacific. So that's first time in a very, very long time. I am on the flip side to that. I am not happy with this idea of putting the Monroe Doctrine and reestablishing the Monroe Doctrine, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, front and center. Because when our Latin American and Caribbean colleagues, when they hear that, they remember the long history of U.S. imperialism and interventionism.
Got it.
In their countries, right?
It's a branding issue.
It's a huge branding issue, and I think I would implore the administration to kind of maybe you can message that here in the United States, but certainly not in the region, right?
The Chevy Nova drives great in the U.S., but the Chevy Nova doesn't do well in Mexico for
exactly. But I will add this in terms of messaging. I think several Latin American and Caribbean countries, they very much view China through the lens of opportunity, right? I mean, they have been providing the viable economic alternatives that have been lacking for so long, from the United States, right? So I think it's going to be hard to message on that, to say, very much beware of X, Y, and Z. But I do think that you can say, beware of ways in which Chinese engagement imperils your sovereignty and exacerbates corruption. I think if you lean in on those two things, sovereignty and corruption, and really talk about the ways in which certain Chinese state-owned enterprises leverage loans, right, in order to infringe on a certain country's sovereignty, and that there's examples of that in this region, but also examples of that in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and elsewhere. And also really bringing up the fact that, again, through this geocriminality, the leveraging of Chinese criminal actors in order to exacerbate corruption, pay off local politicians, and then make an issue that's already kind of a huge issue within Latin America and the Caribbean, which is corruption, making it even worse. So I think really focusing on those two points will really go a long way in increasing concern in the region about China's engagement.
I think that latter point, driving home these countries that are facing up against their formidable domestic cartels and mafias, which are, killing political candidates and carrying out massacres and spreading corruption everywhere. Driving home the fact that Chinese organized crime, sometimes with the aid or awareness of the Chinese state, is empowering and working with and becoming the best allies and service providers for your mafias, would be one obvious thing. Another would be, and this has always struck me as the U.S. not being agile enough in the messaging space. It's not my job to talk about messaging, but as an observer, you always hear, particularly on the left in Latin America, criticisms over the years of the United States, the phrase in Spanish, neoliberalismo salvaje, savage neoliberalism or savage capitalism. What is more savage if you compare the U.S. model to the Chinese one in terms of predatory, aggressive capitalism, basic authoritarianism, abuse of human rights, all these causes which are near and dear to the left. The Latin American left should be confronted with these things, right? The democratic left.
And that's where amplification, branding, messaging is key.
Exactly. Because it's a no-brainer. It's not if you really sit down and make the comparison, I always found it striking that it's somehow considered progressive by left-wing regimes or governments. I'm talking about the democratic ones, not Nicaragua or Cuba. We'd rather work with the Chinese because the Americans are imperialists. Well, Really? Compared to what? Right? And the week,
Right.
and Tibet,
Yeah, right.
and Hong Kong, and you're right. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think it's a. I think that's just a basic observation. I don't even think it's a
Yeah.
political opinion, right? It's just
You
basic.
know, I agree 100% with Sebastian. If I might add, we talk about the messaging in the region, but also what about the messaging right here in the U.S., right?
Sure.
I mean, Sebastian's reporting has been, the vanguard in really talking about the rise of Chinese organized crime in our own borders, right? In rural Oklahoma and Maine and, Northern California. It is crazy that it is not more of a national priority. And I am encouraged by the fact that there have been, various hearings now on the congressional side. I had the opportunity to participate in one, on December 9th, really talking about Chinese organized crime around the world and how it's specifically hurting the U.S. and U.S. national security interests. But I think it's got to be much more of a priority right here in the U.S. And I think, President Trump is going to be meeting with Xi Jinping in Beijing in April of 2026. In addition to fentanyl and Taiwan and trade, he's got to also bring up Chinese criminality, right? And really put Xi Jinping's feet to the fire to say, what are you doing about this?
Yeah, no, that's a great point here. Look, I think this is a pretty vibrant time right now. We've been as a fund focusing just on defense tech, but I think we're starting to realize is there's so much of elements of economic warfare, cognitive warfare that rely on technology, and I think the amplification and the ability of AI to synthesize vast amounts of open source information and data. It's becoming more and more important to me, I think, to making sure that some of those technology resources that we're seeing come in that help solve a national security issue from a data analytics standpoint are directly applied in a realm of OSINT to understand what the Chinese are doing, because they're not hiding. They're hiding in the weeds to a certain extent, but they're not hiding in the shadows. So with the right tech, with the right resources, you can illuminate that pretty quickly here. The other thing that has been kind of encouraged here, and we'll shift into kind of a key takeaways here, but I do advise a handful of groups on geopolitical risk. But what I'm starting to see, I think, it is more of an appetite to explore investment opportunities in the Americas. And this isn't necessarily just American capital that wants to invest in the Americas. In many cases, I think it's capital from an Ecuador, El Salvador, Mexico, Chile, Argentina that wants sovereignty back. They enjoy having time that they spend in the U.S., but they kind of want to make their countries great. They want to push out what is, I think, starting to become viewed as more of a parasitic partner in the CCP. Despite all of our history and issues, they're looking for a counterparty to come in and invest with. And I think there's an opportunity more and more for like-minded, aligned capital from the U.S. to move into this space. So it's an exciting area. There's froth with a ton of risk. I view it as a pile of electrocuted coat hangers intertwined. You can't move one without nudging the others, and you're going to shock yourself if you're not careful. So I think understanding information risk, counterparty risk is going to be critical. I think conversations like this are important. We're at the 45-minute mark here. So what I want to do is I want to give each of you just I guess a chance to just kind of put a topper on what we talked about, and also for our listeners and for the folks that are tuning in, if they want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that as well? So Sebastian, we'll begin with you.
Sure. I mean, I think what Leland said earlier was very important in terms of the lack of attention this gets, given the dimensions and the urgency of it, and not just in Latin America, but right here in this country. And he's done great work in this space, and that hearing was very important. You gave you that the Senate that he was participating in, you're starting to feel like at least there's some attention being paid, but still, when I did the stories about the takeover of the marijuana underworld by Chinese organized crime, and I wrote a series of stories that got a lot of attention. And I was struck by the fact that people were just stunned. People had no idea, right? It was just the idea that Chinese organized crime wasn't just involved, but was, deeply involved in dominating this was, like news from halfway around the world, right?
Yeah.
And that should not be. And I think partly it's because, look, these are difficult, subtle, disciplined groups that move very quietly, while the cartels and other criminal groups are very ostentatiously involved in sort of the stuff that gets on television series, right? And there is this problem of and some things are very basic, like lack of interpreters, lack of Chinese, have to go out and recruit more Chinese American police officers and analysts, right? I mean, I'm struck by the fact, being partly Italian American, when there's still a case, every once in a while there'll still be a case involving La Cosa Nostra, and of course that's the headline if it's an Italian mafia case, some 75-year-old who's shaking people down in Brooklyn still, right? But when the cases in which the Chinese organized crime is involved, it's so hard to understand, infiltrate, gather information about the triads. There's a reluctance even to talk about them, even in prosecuting documents, right? Because they're just such an area where we really have to work harder. I think the other very important thing is stovepiping that, on something like fentanyl. I had the former head of FBI counterintelligence talking to me about fentanyl, and this whole question of the state role was like, look, at the FBI, we've got the criminal division, which follows the organized crime stuff, and we've got counterintelligence, which is looking for spies. But this area where those two things, where crime and the state converge, and the same could be true with Iran as well, we're not really built, that falls between the cracks among agencies and even within agencies. And that is something that needs to be rethought, absolutely. And it would be useful both on the Chinese front and for this, because there are other actors like Russia and Iran doing it. It would be useful in many ways to rethink task forces along these lines. So I think, more attention, more messaging, but just also some of this practical, granular stuff that has to be done in terms of really literally understanding and focusing on this phenomenon in its totality.
Great. That's awesome.
100%. Just want to foot stomp some of the things that Sebastian was saying. One is the need to create an interagency task force specifically focused on Chinese organized crime, right? Right now there's one towards money laundering, there's one towards the digital scams, but again, got to break down those silos, especially between law enforcement and counterintelligence. I've been in conversations where the law enforcement folks are saying, oh, well, they may have CCP ties, so that's a counterintelligence thing. And then the counterintelligence folks are like, yeah, but they're criminals, so it should be a law enforcement thing. It's like, no, it's both, right? So you've got to create that. You also got to create a global task force on this too, because again, as we were saying, this is popping up everywhere around the world. And I think it behooves us to learn best practices from some countries that have dealt with Chinese organized crime much longer than we have. Australia, Taiwan, Singapore, and elsewhere. Third, Hamlet, to your point, the leveraging of technology. I'm actually working my team right now on building a AI-powered dashboard and map that would try to track Chinese illicit activities to help law enforcement agents identify these trends early and often, so that they can be prepared, if and when these trends pop up in rural Oklahoma, right?
Yeah.
And lastly, just again, continue to drive home the need to elevate this issue. And if President Trump can bring this issue to the forefront during his meeting with Xi Jinping in April 2026, that would be helpful, because if we want to destroy these narco-terrorists, of course we can do that by blowing up boats. But we also need to destroy the financial network that are supporting these TCOs, and that runs through that Silk Road of crime enabled by China.
No, these are great takeaways. I love the term geocriminality. I think it's spot on. And I think if you have a geocriminality unit or initiative that's focused on the CCP, I think we're very quickly going to realize that those syndicates touch the Iranian networks that are out there operating in the Americas and in Latin America, and they're going to run right into the Russian organized crime syndicates that are all working together. I don't think there's a coincidence, given my prior profession and what's happening geopolitically. I think the belligerence in the Ukraine war, I think the belligerence of the hegemonic Iranian regime and their strikes against Israel, and China kind of turning up their aggressiveness on the geopolitical scale. I don't think any of that is as a coincidence, nor do I think there's a coincidence that underlying that is the great networks, the shadow networks and the criminal networks that they're working with. But also in many cases, they're finding the weakness in Western society, which is our open society, and using that as kind of the buffer zone they need to operate and advance their narratives and their missions. So I think amplifying this is critical. I want to thank you guys for making the time to come on the podcast here. I think this is a great effort by the Irregular Warfare Initiative to amplify the urgency and basically start educating people on how and where to get involved. I think it's imperative, but I also think unleashing free markets and free enterprise is the proper approach. The only way you can really do that efficiently is through education and informing the masses, whether they're policymakers, academics, investors, technologists. So if China's throwing a whole of government or a whole of society effort here in Cold War 2.0, they work on a conscript army, so they're being voluntold what to do. In our case, we've always relished on a kind of an all-volunteer army. So I think it's time for patriotic capital. Academic citizens find out where to get involved and get active. And the last point here, I think Leland, you touched on it. Lessons learned from the Afghan war and the conflict in Iraq. Kicking down a door and shooting a terrorist in the face is one thing, but that replicates itself. You started seeing significant degradation of ISIS and Al Qaeda when we reached in there and didn't just go after the trigger pullers, but we identified the facilitation networks, their supply chain networks, their banking networks, their legitimate legal and economic apparatus that was fueling the illicit activity. When you started ripping out networks, that's when you started seeing the most amount of impact. So I think in this case, if we're trying to attack geocriminality, understanding how these networks work, understanding how these networks function is key. And I do think some of the innovations that we're seeing in tech, in data analytics, AI, it's going to be important to start applying those to this problem set as well. So I want to thank you all again for your time. Again, a special thanks for the Irregular Warfare Initiative for helping with this. I'm delighted to be part of the program. Looking forward to doing more conversations like this. And heck, I think I'd be more than happy to revisit this in 3 months and see how much our bitch session influenced policy and action. If not, then I think we just got to refine our tuning and making sure that that we don't market Chevy Novas in Mexico. That's a bad proposition. So, anyways, thank you all for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Pleasure.